February 15th, 1946, Atsugi Air Base, Japan. The morning mist clung to the tarmac like cigarette smoke in a crowded bar, carrying with it the metallic scent of aircraft fuel and the distant aroma of American coffee brewing in mess tents. Lieutenant Michiko Tanaka stood at rigid attention beside 17 other Japanese women officers, their once proud Imperial Navy uniforms now threadbare and patched, the golden cherry blossoms on their collars tarnished by 2 years of defeat and occupation. The fabric hung loose on frames that had grown thin during the final months of the war, when rice rations dwindled to nothing and victory gardens produced more hope than vegetables. Each woman clutched a small bundle, the sum total of their remaining possessions, while American transport planes thundered overhead, their engines drowning out the nervous whispers that passed between them like prayers. Tanaka's fingers traced the worn brass buttons of her jacket, each one a small defiance against the reality of surrender. She had sewn these buttons herself in 1943, when Japan still believed in the divinity of their cause and the inevitability of American collapse. Now, as she watched a convoy of olive green trucks approach through the morning haze, those same buttons felt like relics from a civilization that no longer existed. The trucks bore the white star of the United States Army, and with them came not the brutal conquerors she had been taught to expect, but something far more unsettling. Women in clean uniforms, who smiled as they stepped down from the vehicles, their arms laden with parcels wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The transformation of Japan's female military officers from warriors to prisoners represented one of the war's most profound psychological casualties. These women had been among the empire's most devoted servants, trained in the ancient code of Bushido, and indoctrinated with the belief that death was preferable to dishonor. Lieutenant Tanaka herself had graduated from the Imperial Navy Women's Academy in 1941 with the highest marks in her class, her mind sharp with tactical knowledge, and her spirit hardened by 3 years of preparation for total war. She had coordinated submarine patrols in the South Pacific, managed communication networks across the Japanese mainland, and had fully expected to die fighting American invaders on the beaches of Honan. For 5 years, Japanese propaganda had painted American women as soft, materialistic creatures who would crumble under the pressure of total war. Japanese officers had been taught that American society was fundamentally weak because it allowed women to pursue individual happiness rather than sacrificing everything for the state. Yet here were American military women who had served with distinction throughout the Pacific Campaign, now extending kindness to their former enemies, with a casualness that seemed to mock everything the Japanese had believed about Western decadence. The lead American officer, Captain Sarah Morrison from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted her nation's eventual victory. Her uniform was pressed and clean, her boots polished to a mirror shine that reflected the morning sun like beacons of abundance. She carried herself with the relaxed authority of democratic citizenship, not the rigid posture of imperial subservience that had defined Japanese military bearing, but the fluid grace of someone who had grown up believing that authority derived from competence rather than divine appointment. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat vowels of the American Midwest, each word a small assertion of the prosperity that had made victory possible. "Ladies," Captain Morrison said, her translator quickly converting the English into Japanese, "we know this transition has been difficult for all of you. These packages contain clothing donated by American women who wanted to help you rebuild your lives." The word rebuild struck the Japanese officers like a physical blow. They had been prepared for punishment, for humiliation, for the kind of brutal occupation that Japanese forces had inflicted across Asia. Instead, they were being offered the chance to start over, to construct new identities from the wreckage of their imperial dreams. Lieutenant Tanaka watched as the American women began distributing the packages, each one labeled with careful handwriting that revealed its origins. From the Ladies' Auxiliary of First Baptist Church, Topeka, Kansas. With prayers for peace, St. Mary's Parish, Burlington, Vermont. From the Working Women of Detroit, Sisters in Service. The labels themselves were small victories of American logistics, evidence of a civilian population so prosperous and organized that they could spare The Japanese officers had expected American occupation to mirror their own brutal conquests in China, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia. They had been taught that all nations were fundamentally predatory, that mercy was merely weakness disguised as virtue. The systematic cruelty of Japanese military occupation had been justified by the belief that this was simply how powerful nations behaved, that Americans would inevitably respond to victory with the same sadistic efficiency that Japanese forces had displayed in Nanking, Manila, and countless smaller towns across the Pacific Theater. Instead, the packages contained practical clothing selected with thoughtful consideration for the recipient's needs: wool skirts and cotton blouses, undergarments and stockings, even small bottles of perfume and tubes of lipstick that represented a luxury most Japanese women had not experienced since 1942. Each item was clean, well-made, and chosen with an attention to dignity that contradicted everything the Japanese military had taught about American character. The clothing was not uniform or institutional, but personal. Dresses in different styles and colors that acknowledged the individuality of the women who would wear them. When Lieutenant Tanaka opened her package, she found a blue wool dress with small pearl buttons and a note written in careful English. For a new beginning, from Mary Catherine O'Brien, whose son served in the Pacific. May we all find peace. The dress was well-tailored, made from fabric that would have been impossible to obtain in wartime Japan, where women had learned to make clothing from repurposed rice sacks and military tarpaulins. The pearl buttons alone represented more luxury than most Japanese civilians had seen in years, each one a small demonstration of American industrial capacity and civilian prosperity. The emotional impact was immediate and devastating. Across the formation of Japanese officers, women who had maintained rigid military composure throughout years of training and months of defeat began to weep. Not the controlled tears of military ceremony, but the raw sobbing of psychological collapse. These were tears that carried the weight of everything they had believed about themselves, their nation, and their enemies. Each tear was an admission that they had been wrong about the fundamental character of Americans. Sub-Lieutenant Keiko Hayashi, who had coordinated kamikaze attacks from a command bunker on Kyushu, held up a green cardigan with trembling hands and whispered, "They are showing us kindness." The statement carried the force of revelation. For 2 years, she had helped plan suicide missions, based on the certainty that Americans were inhuman monsters who would torture and enslave any Japanese who fell into their hands. The propaganda films had shown American soldiers bayoneting civilians, desecrating shrines, and committing atrocities that justified any sacrifice to prevent invasion. Instead, she was being offered a cardigan knitted by someone named Dorothy Chen from San Francisco, complete with a small American flag pin and a note expressing hope for friendship between former enemies. The symbolic power of the clothing extended far beyond its practical value. These were not military uniforms or institutional garments, but expressions of American civilian culture, the diverse, individualistic society that Japanese propaganda had dismissed as fatally weak. The dresses came in different styles, colors, and patterns, each one reflecting the personal taste of its donor, rather than conforming to some centralized aesthetic. This diversity itself was a kind of propaganda, a demonstration that American strength emerged from individual freedom, rather than collective submission. Captain Morrison watched the emotional breakdown of the Japanese officers with the steady compassion of someone who had seen similar scenes across the Pacific theater. American military women had been present at the liberation of dozens of Japanese installations, and they had learned to recognize the particular trauma of ideological collapse. These officers were not merely defeated soldiers, but believers, whose faith had been shattered by contact with a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught to expect. "Take your time," Captain Morrison said quietly, her translator converting the words into Japanese. "There's no hurry." The casual kindness of the statement was itself a form of psychological warfare, more effective than any interrogation technique. Japanese military culture had been built on urgency, on the constant pressure of crisis that justified any sacrifice in service of the emperor. American abundance, by contrast, was demonstrated through leisure, through the luxury of taking time to treat former enemies with dignity. His final letter had spoken of his honor in dying for the emperor, and his certainty that his sacrifice would help prevent American invasion of the homeland. He had died believing that he was protecting Japan from monsters who would rape and pillage their way across the sacred islands. Instead, those same Americans were now clothing his sister with garments donated by their own women, treating her defeat as an opportunity for reconciliation rather than revenge. The clothing distribution continued for nearly 2 hours, with American officers helping Japanese women try on different garments and ensuring proper fit. The scene had the surreal quality of a civilian charity event rather than a military occupation, complete with American women offering advice about color coordination and style. Several Japanese officers broke down completely when American seamstresses appeared with portable sewing machines to alter garments that didn't fit properly, transforming the air base into an impromptu tailor shop where former enemies worked together to ensure everyone was properly clothed. The most powerful moment came when Warrant Officer Yuki Nakamura, who had lost her husband in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, was presented with a wedding dress that had been donated by a young American bride who had married her fiancé just days before he shipped out to the Pacific. The dress was white silk with delicate lace trim, preserved in tissue paper with a note that read, "I wore this dress for one day of happiness. May it bring you many days of peace." Nakamura collapsed entirely, her sobs echoing across the tarmac as she clutched the dress to her chest like a talisman against the grief that had consumed her since 1944. The wedding dress became the symbolic center of the entire event, representing not just American generosity, but the possibility of transformation that lay at the heart of democratic ideology. In Japanese culture, a widow was expected to remain permanently mourning, to define herself through her loss rather than seeking new happiness. The American wedding dress offered a different possibility, that grief could be honored without becoming permanent, that individual human flourishing was worth pursuing, even after profound loss. Captain Morrison found herself moved by the depth of emotion displayed by the Japanese officers. Many of these women had been trained to suppress their individual humanity in service of an abstract imperial ideal, and the simple act of receiving personal kindness from former enemies was causing that suppression to collapse. The American military women who participated in the clothing distribution had their own complex emotions about the event. Many had lost friends, brothers, and fiancés to Japanese military action throughout the Pacific Theater. Petty Officer First Class Janet Sullivan from Boston had lost her twin brother at Pearl Harbor, while Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez from El Paso had spent 18 months coordinating supply drops to American prisoners of war in Japanese camps. Their willingness to extend kindness to former enemies represented a conscious choice to prioritize future peace over past grievance, to embody the democratic values they had fought to defend. The transformation of Japanese attitudes toward American women was particularly profound. Japanese military propaganda had consistently portrayed American women as frivolous and weak, more concerned with cosmetics and fashion than with serious matters of war and governance. The presence of competent American military women in positions of real authority challenged these stereotypes in ways that no amount of counter-propaganda could have achieved. These were women who had served with distinction throughout the Pacific Campaign, who had earned their rank through demonstrated competence, and who now wielded the authority of victory with a restraint that contradicted everything Japanese officers had been taught about American character. The symbolic power of the pearl buttons on Lieutenant Tanaka's blue dress extended far beyond their material value. Pearl diving had been a traditional occupation for Japanese women for centuries, a dangerous profession that exemplified the intersection of feminine grace and physical courage that defined traditional Japanese gender roles. American pearl buttons, mass-produced in factories, represented a different model of feminine contribution. Not individual heroism in dangerous circumstances, but collective prosperity generated through industrial efficiency. The buttons were small symbols of an economic system that could provide luxury goods to ordinary citizens, while simultaneously supporting the largest military mobilization in human history. As the clothing distribution concluded, the Japanese officers began to change from their military uniforms into the donated civilian clothes. The transformation was both practical and symbolic. They were literally shedding the identity that had defined them since adolescence and adopting the clothing of a former enemy nation. The blue wool dress fit Lieutenant Tanaka perfectly, as if it had been tailored specifically for her frame. When she looked in the small mirror provided by the American seamstresses, she saw a different person. Not a defeated Imperial Japanese Navy officer, but simply a young woman in an attractive dress who might have been from anywhere in the world. The psychological impact of this transformation was immediate and profound. For the first time since 1941, these women were not defined primarily by their military rank or their service to the emperor. They were individuals with personal tastes, individual bodies, individual futures that might extend beyond the narrow parameters of imperial service. The donated clothing offered them the possibility of civilian identity in a society that had not recognized civilian existence for nearly a decade. Captain Morrison gathered the Japanese officers for final remarks as the event concluded. Standing before women who were now dressed in American clothing, donated by American civilians, she spoke about the shared experience of military service and the possibility of friendship between former enemies. Her words were carefully chosen to acknowledge the reality of past conflict, while emphasizing the potential for future cooperation. A balance that reflected the broader American approach to post-war occupation and reconstruction. War makes enemies of people who might otherwise be friends, Captain Morrison said, her translator converting the English into Japanese that retained some of the original's Midwestern cadence. We hope these clothes will help you as you build new lives in a peaceful Japan. The women who donated them wanted you to know that they hold no hatred in their hearts, only hope for a better future for all of us. The statement was both diplomatic and personal, reflecting the American belief that individual relationships could transcend national conflicts. The Japanese officers bowed in unison, a gesture that carried different meaning than the rigid military salutes they had offered to their own commanders. This was a bow of gratitude rather than submission, an acknowledgement of kindness received rather than authority accepted. The distinction was subtle. Lieutenant Tanaka found herself thinking about the woman who had donated her blue dress, Mary Catherine O'Brien, whose son had served in the Pacific Theater and who had nevertheless chosen to extend kindness to former enemies. The note, tucked into the dress pocket, spoke of finding peace, a sentiment that seemed both personal and political. O'Brien had lost a son to the same military system that had claimed Tanaka's brother, yet she was offering reconciliation rather than revenge. This generosity represented something fundamentally different from the zero-sum nationalism that had dominated Japanese thinking throughout the war years. As the American trucks prepared to transport the Japanese officers to temporary housing facilities, the transformed women gathered their few remaining possessions and prepared for an uncertain future. They were no longer military officers serving an emperor who had surrendered, but they were not yet civilians with established roles in a democratic society. The donated clothing represented a bridge between these identities, a material foundation for psychological reconstruction that would take years to complete. The blue wool dress would remain in Lieutenant Tanaka's possession for the rest of her life, becoming a tangible connection to the moment when her understanding of American character underwent fundamental revision. She would wear it to her first job interview at a Tokyo department store in 1947, to her wedding to a former Imperial Army sergeant in 1949, and to countless other occasions when she needed to remember that transformation was possible, even after complete defeat. The pearl buttons would eventually be replaced as they loosened with age, but she kept the originals in a small wooden box as reminders of the day when enemies became benefactors through simple acts of human kindness. The transformation of Japanese women officers from military servants to civilian individuals reflected broader changes in post-war Japanese society, where American occupation policies deliberately promoted individual rights over collective obligation. The donated clothing was part of a larger program of cultural exchange, designed to demonstrate democratic values through concrete actions, rather than abstract propaganda. American occupation authorities recognized that ideological change required more than new laws and constitutions. It required personal experiences that contradicted the fundamental assumptions of authoritarian thinking. However, the deeper significance of the event lay not in its propaganda value, but in its demonstration of how democratic societies could treat former enemies. The clothing donation represented American abundance, but more importantly, it represented American choice. The decision to respond to victory with generosity rather than vengeance, to seek reconciliation rather than humiliation. Years later, when Lieutenant Tanaka had become Mrs. Yamamoto and was raising 3 children in democratic Japan, she would tell them about the day American women gave her new clothes. Her children, who had grown up with American bases nearby and American products in their stores, found it difficult to understand how profound that gift had been for their mother's generation. They lived in a Japan where American friendship was taken for granted, where the blue wool dress hanging in their mother's closet seemed like an ordinary garment rather than a symbol of ideological transformation. The wedding dress donated to Warrant Officer Nakamura had an even more profound impact on post-war Japanese society. Nakamura eventually remarried, wearing the American wedding dress to her second ceremony in 1948. The image of a Japanese war widow finding happiness in an American wedding dress became a powerful symbol of the possibility for renewal and hope after devastating loss. The dress itself became a kind of religious artifact, loaned to other Japanese war widows who chose to remarry rather than remain permanently in mourning. The practical impact of the clothing donation extended far beyond its symbolic meaning. Many of the Japanese officers had literally no civilian clothes, having lived in military uniform since their teenage years. The donated garments provided them with the basic foundation needed to seek civilian employment and begin building new lives outside the military hierarchy that had defined their existence since adolescence. The quality of the clothing also demonstrated American prosperity in ways that mere statistics could not, showing rather than telling the story of a society wealthy enough to give away high-quality garments to former enemies. The pearl buttons on Lieutenant Tanaka's blue dress caught the light as she walked toward the American truck that would transport her to temporary housing. Each small flash of reflected sunlight was like a signal, a message of hope transmitted from one woman. The buttons had been sewn on by Mary Catherine O'Brien in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, while thinking about a Japanese woman she would never meet, but whose humanity she chose to acknowledge through this small act of generosity. As the trucks pulled away from Atsugi Air Base, Lieutenant Tanaka looked back at the site of her transformation from imperial officer to civilian individual. The morning mist had burned away, revealing the clear blue sky that would become the background for Japan's reconstruction as a democratic ally of the United States. The blue wool dress would fade with repeated washing. The pearl buttons would eventually need replacement, but the memory of American women extending kindness to former enemies would remain vivid for the rest of her life. The clothing distribution at Atsugi Air Base was repeated at dozens of military installations across occupied Japan, each event carefully documented by American authorities as evidence of successful democratization efforts. However, the deeper significance of these exchanges lay not in their political impact, but in their human dimension. The recognition that individual dignity could transcend national conflict, that former enemies could become friends through simple acts of kindness and respect. The transformation of Japanese attitudes toward American society would prove to be one of the most enduring legacies of the Pacific War, creating an alliance that would survive the challenges of the Cold War and extend into the 21st century. The foundation of that alliance was not built primarily through diplomatic negotiations or security agreements, but through thousands of individual encounters like the clothing distribution at Atsugi Air Base, where American abundance and democratic values were demonstrated through concrete actions rather than abstract promises. Lieutenant Tanaka would live to see Japan become one of America's closest allies, would watch her children study at American universities and work for American companies, would witness the transformation of former enemies into partners in building a more peaceful world. When she died in 2003, she was buried wearing the blue wool dress that had marked her transformation from imperial officer to democratic citizen. The pearl buttons still catching light like small beacons of the hope that had emerged from the ashes of total war. The blue dress became more than clothing. It became memory, testimony, and promise. It represented the moment when Lieutenant Michiko Tanaka discovered that her enemies were human beings, capable of extraordinary generosity, that defeat could become the foundation for renewal, and that individual dignity could survive even the collapse of everything she had been taught to believe about herself and her world. In the end, the pearl buttons that caught the morning light at Atsugi Air Base had illuminated something far more valuable than their own modest gleam. They had reflected the possibility of peace between peoples who had learned to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow human beings deserving of respect, kindness, and hope for a better future.